And here is Jeff.
Do you know what you do not call a sunny day in Western Washington? Saturday or Sunday? Yet this Sunday was sunny. It was quiet, and the geologist was indoors and was very bored until the radio crackled to life. Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it. 5 simple words that initiated the biggest natural disaster in the recorded history of Western Washington, the Pacific Northwest. May 18th, 1980, a magnitude 5 earthquake shattered the north face of Mount St. Helens. 1,300 vertical feet of rocks crumbled and collapsed. That's twice the height of the Space Needle. Magma, liquid rock, hot enough to melt aluminum, exploded horizontally, leveling and then incinerating everything in its path. The heat of that explosion incinerated centuries-old glaciers. The torrents of meltwater triggered mudflows the consistency of wet cement. Those mudflows were massive enough that they obliterated anything and everything in their path. Within 18 minutes after that eruption, the ash cloud had reached 80,000 feet. That's twice the cruising altitude of a transoceanic jet. It was my job and that of my crew to fly beneath the ash flow, above the mud flow, to stay clear of ejecting flying rocks and debris, but to get as close to that erupting volcano as we possibly could to see and document exactly what was going on. They had called that a blast zone. It was really a death zone. There was no color, no motion, no life. As we flew into that, we felt a profound sense of disorientation. We were told very shortly to be on the lookout for any survivors, but also for any bodies. And all too soon we saw both. I was back to doing my first broadcast, and my engineer handed me quietly a small slip of paper. And he said, "This is the latest estimate of the number of missing and presumed dead." And then very quietly, he looked at me and he said, "And told we'll know some of the names on that list." "Stand by," came the cue. 5, 4, dozens presumed dead. 3, 2, who do I know that's on that list? 1, go! And I was on camera. I don't remember much of those broadcasts. Initially, I thought that was probably a very good thing. But when I got back into Seattle and looked at some of the recordings, I was amazed to see there was very little reflection outwardly of the inner turmoil, the emotional pain that I felt inside at that time. It was a case of professional training, professional expertise, and plain focus that had not only transported me out of that physical blast zone, but out of that emotional blast zone as well. As I moved on, I came to recognize that in live television, as so many fields, stress is not an option, it's a given. The option is how you're going to respond to it. We have that choice whether we allow our mind to be the master or the servant. My choice, my advice, my learning has been we need to make it the servant. I like to listen, or like to think of my brain as a bit like a radio station. I think back to my first paying job in broadcasting, and I was working at a small FM radio station. Their general format was easy listening and classical music. Older people loved it. That's who I was doing my news broadcast to. They loved to set it on their clock radios and wake up to easy sounds. This particular morning, the last thing they heard were some very silky stringed instruments playing. And then the syrupy voice of an announcer came on and said, "Our management has decided to better serve our listening audience. We are changing formats from WTMJ FM to WKTI Super Rock around the clock." And you had this supercharged hard rock of Steppenwolf. Sookie, 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 soo! And then, get your motor running. I won't sing, I had a choir teacher throw a shoe at me one time, but you can imagine the telephone bank lit up like a neon sign above a cheap, sketchy used car lot. You can imagine the listeners were not at all amused. There were the angry callers. What do you think you're doing? Those who were almost in tears. Why? And then the memorable ones like, young man, the last thing I want at 7 a.m. is for my husband to get his motor running. What do you think these viewers and listeners did? They changed the channel. They changed stations. And that, in a moment of high stress, sudden stress, is exactly what we need to do. We need to change the channel. And hopefully not to something saying, get your motor running at that moment. So how do I, working in live television, transform sudden stress so it doesn't become sudden death? There may be several 100,000 people working out there. We may be in different fields, but we've all encountered some of those same emotions, some of those same feelings that I did. I found there are basically 5 keys. One is to recognize what you're feeling. We can work through this together. We've all had things that bother us. Just draw it to mind. It might be people eating too much fat and sugar. It might be people not getting in touch with their real feelings. Attorneys that are turned off about the business side, and it might be people that are not being sensitive to other people's needs. Just picture that in mind. Feel your pulse increasing a little bit. The first thing to do is to realize those are your feelings. They are not you. Your feelings and you are not the same thing. That's step 1. Step number 2 is to breathe. And breathe into your stomach slowly. Don't force it. Don't worry about your stomach puffing out. We're not going to be posing for GQ or Victoria's Secret here. But breathe in, and then gradually let it out. Do it at least 3 times. Breathe in again. Breathe out. And in and out. The next step is to get in touch with your body again. That moment when I heard, you'll know some of the names on that list of fatalities, I shrank to this really small spot in my head. I was having an out-of-body experience. I needed to re-inhabit my body. Tense your legs and your feet. Feel that. Release it. Tense it again and release it. Tense your stomach. Release that. Feel the relaxation. And then tense your basically trunk and your head and neck. And you can do it without it being obvious. And release that. Suddenly you'll begin to realize you have a body. Pick 3 things that you can look at. Maybe the walls, maybe the outdoors, maybe the carpet. It's getting you in contact with your environment. And then finally, listen to 3 things. It may be the sound of the children next door. It may be the sound of your breath. It may be the sound of a favorite song that you just hum very, very quietly. Not soupy, 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 soupy. But those 5 steps help you re-inhabit your body and gives you a perspective rather than simply focusing on your source of stress. So that sudden stress flees. That perspective, I have found, is all important. And one of the things that really taught me that was back on May 18th, 1980. Remember when I told you the engineer handed me that piece of paper and said, you'll recognize some of the names on this list? He was right. I did. There were 57 dead people that ultimately died in that eruption. One of them was my friend Dr. David Johnston of the U.S. Geological Survey. He was the one that uttered the words, Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it, seconds before he was blasted off his mountain observation post. His body was never found. If you go down to Mount St. Helens, you'll see the monument, you'll see his name on that. I never really had a sense of what Vietnam War veterans felt when they visited the War Memorial until I saw my friend's name on that memorial outside Mount St. Helens. I went to visit his dad 2 months after the eruption, and I wasn't looking forward to that conversation. I thought, he's probably going to wonder, why did my son die, and why is this young man still here? We had a deeply enriching conversation. Just before I left, he looked at me and he said, you know, part of me wishes I'd never encouraged David to get interested in volcanoes and geology. But he said, David used to say to me that, for me, Dad, each day is an adventure. Each day is an opportunity to learn something new, to use that knowledge to get better at what I do, and to use that knowledge and that skill to help other people. That's perspective. That's what, if we keep that in mind, the coping strategies are important, but that stress that we had in the moment will suddenly just be excess baggage. Excess baggage we don't need to hold on to. And you don't want to, because you know what the airlines do. They charge you extra for it. Oh, that's right. Let me get a swig. Your mouth does get dry up there.
You go, Ron.
Okay. There were so many good things that you did. It was just awesome. The one thing that I know, one of the things that you want to do is get out of the niche and be a meteorologist.
Right, stand in the same
Yeah.
place.
So what I'd like you to do is somehow work into this presentation that you're a professional speaker, that you're a keynote speaker of presentation.
Okay.
So for instance, you might say, when I work with audiences like this and do a presentation, and then you can deliver 5 suggestions. So find some opportunities to do that. Again, everybody knows you're already famous for one thing, so what you want to
We're
do is...
infamous.
Right. So you want to plan in their mind, especially if they're local, you know, if you're outside of the Seattle marketplace,
Right.
maybe not so much. But you want to make sure that they know that there's much more to you than that.
Mhm.
And if you, I don't know if you want to do coaching or things like that, you can also plant the seeds when they work with individuals or... The other thing is, I wasn't sure that the transition between the volcano story and then suddenly the radio station, I got lost. I wasn't sure what you want to do. So pay attention to that to see what that, and like Lisa said, the transition. Then the third one was, you started to say there's 5 things. So remember, there's 5 things. So don't speak as you're moving
Right.
over there. And again, this is new to you, so, but just watch the internet. Okay. So,
Thank you.
you're welcome.
Go ahead.
Good luck.
Okay, before I offer some thoughts, Jeff, can you give me an idea of the number 1 primary source of income in your business model as you're thinking through?
As I look at it right now, I really don't see coaching so much. I think it's going to be more doing keynotes.
Keynotes, perfect. Okay, so towards that end, first thing that I wrote, great use of humor in the opening. I believe you're a master storyteller. And one of the things that I was going to offer, if you hadn't thought of keynoting as being your primary source of income, you will blow it away. What I would encourage you to do, I like the stories that you can tell. And it doesn't bother me that you are a renowned retired meteorologist, 30 years on television. I wouldn't run away from that. I would embrace it. But think about, so this one was, 5 tools for de-stressing, right?
Right.
You might have 5 tools to become a more effective leader, or 5 ways to perform well under pressure. Again,
Right.
depending on the audience. So the meet the body for 30-minute keynote. Give them a good 10 or 15 minutes of content, and then give them 10 or 15 minutes of wow.
Yeah.
I get to hear a part of a story that I never got exposure to before. Let's see. The note that I wrote, the professionalism, you were talking about the incongruence between the inner turmoil you were feeling when you were watching yourself on the broadcast and the external image of being a professional. I think there's something there that can be leveraged to a broader audience. I think of stress, my personal opinion, I think when you're speaking on leadership, which is more of an executive level topic as opposed to stress, which obviously has workplace application, but probably thought of as more of an HR issue. So Lisa or Ron will be able to help with this, I'm sure. In NSA, they talk about the 7 topics that keynoters are hired for. And one is leadership.
Peak performance is
Peak
another one.
performance.
Peak performance.
Change management.
Yep.
The talk, and 2 things that I'll just say, so it's really hit home very well. One thing is, I forgot I was going to relate the fact that there are 5 elements of stress and turning that into confident performance, but today we'll just talk about one, and I zoned out on that. And what we sort of keyed on, and we were talking about possible titles, is transforming stress into confident performance on cue. And so that, does that sound like that would matter?
I think that is great. And maybe that's an A or an A minus. If you want to understand what people are hiring for,
Right.
I would lock in on the 7 topics that keynote
Okay.
is
Yeah.
hired for.
Yeah,
And
there's
start,
a list.
yeah, there is a list, there absolutely is. And then start developing keynote titles and programs consistent
Okay.
with what people are writing checks for.
Okay, yeah.
And sometimes just changing a word, if you go from stress to stressors, it changes the context. You know, stressors on executives rather than executive stress.
Okay,
It really changes it. So sometimes just the word that you use.
that's really helpful, thank you.
Right.
It was, you did a great job, really. I loved how you're very comfortable on a stage, and I loved your in the now moment, whether it's the stress of the children outside, because it was. That's brilliant.
Yeah.
Because people, and everyone in the room noticed it, so acknowledge the elephant in the room, because
Right.
everybody was like, what's wrong with those kids? Because you're thinking about doing keynotes, try not to keep everything very Northwest. Like, people are gonna know
Right.
Mount St. Helens, but they're not gonna know how tall the Space Needle is. So make more of a general reference of height that people will have something to relate to no matter who you're talking to.
Pick a building, maybe,
Right,
could I do it
some-
in their city, or just
Yeah.
something that's?
If
really-
it's-
That's the
oh, that's
best.
even better,
Okay.
that's even better. So you would have to change it each presentation, but that's brilliant.
I'd have to maybe
That way.
think of how tall the Washington Monument or the Empire
Exactly.
State.
Right,
Building
just
might
get different buildings with stats, but something that people will know, the Statue of Liberty,
Okay.
the Eiffel Tower, something that they can relate to. And
That's-
if it's 3 times the height, say it's half the size of the Eiffel Tower, or,
Right.
pick common buildings. When you said, we had to fly as low as, say what you said about flying low and
be. Oh,
flying
we
high.
had to fly below the ash, above the mud flow, staying clear of flying rocks and debris. and
Okay,
get us-
so what I wanted to see you do was, we had to fly below, like
Oh,
go
okay.
really down and down, so people know you were like right there, and then up on your tippy toes for the highest point.
Okay.
You know, like do a really big height difference, so that
Mhm.
people will get the gravity of
Right.
how, that tiny little space you were in.
Okay,
When you're going from a story to your data, your content, pause.
right,
I think because of your background, you're continually filling the hole and the space and no dead air.
yeah,
So I think for you, and most people do it, but I think you're trained not to, is to take pauses when you
Right.
transition. Really good stage movement. I keyed in on something you said, and I'm not quite sure how you can use it, so the group might be able to help. Sudden stress does not equal sudden death. I don't know how to, where or how to fit that in, but it's a really good catchphrase. Sudden stress should not equal sudden death, or something.
Right.
that brings
That
us-
might be a tagline to
Mhm.
the program.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah. That's it, good job.
great, thank you.